You are now listening to Testimonies with Terry.
All right, guys. Well, I am here with the very powerful, very inspirational rock artist, Matt Sassano. Matt, thank you so much for coming on, man.
Hey, man, greetings from Tennessee. It's good to be here, man, and thank you so much for having me on. I'm looking forward to the conversation.
Yeah, when I was asked about doing this interview and I looked into, I just knew that I had to do this because we have so much. It seems like so much in common with our obviously passion for mental health and raising awareness for that. But man, your music is legit. I love your music and just how raw and real it is. And I'm excited to get to know you more and delve deeper into your story.
Yeah, man. I mean, this season of the music has really been an adventure, man. I mean, recording my new EP in Defiance with Josiah Prince was a milestone for me as somebody who was raised in a small town, and just really there wasn't. I love the people there, but a lot of them were very small town minded, so there was no big dreaming going on. So to think that I would go from, that 15-year-old kid listening to Disciple, walking around in my hometown to now recording and seeing the music take off like it is and have such the impact that it's having is an awesome thing.
Yeah, praise God, man. Praise God. Well, I'm excited to dig into your story, but before we do that, another reason I knew that we'd click so well is because, like myself, you're huge into 90s nostalgia. And
Oh my God.
specifically, it looks like the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles. And so, man, I got to ask, who's your favorite turtle?
All right, dude. You know what is so funny, man? I was watching I know a lot of people will give me flack for this because they're all about the 90s, the original TMNT, but I actually did like the Nickelodeon version as well. And I watched that just last night and I had this conversation and I'm like, which turtle do you think I best reflect? And my girlfriend was like, hey, man, I think you're a little bit of like Michelangelo and a little bit of Donatello. You're not like, you're a little over the top, but you're also smart as well. So I took that both as kind of a compliment. But I would say I got to go with Michelangelo, just the down to earth guy, man.
Yep.
How
Yeah.
about
Hard
you?
hard to choose against him. Yeah, mine kind of switches, but I like Raph, man. So I grew up with the cartoon and just kind of that snarkiness. I don't know, it just kind of made me laugh, and so I like Raph. My Jeep is kind of green and red, same colors as him, and so I call it Raph for short. And so, yeah, man, I'm a shellhead myself. What are some other things from '90s nostalgia that you're big into?
Like literally everything, man. Like I'm not much into the new gaming systems, and I know I'm aging myself here. A lot of people will be like, dude, Xbox One, PS3, but if you set me in front of a Nintendo 64 with GoldenEye or like Turok
Yeah,
Dinosaur
man.
Hunter or PS1 with like Metal Gear Solid, any of that stuff gaming wise is my thing. And also I was big into like Nickelodeon growing up. I was in that era. So I am the guy that like gets thrilled, as cheesy as it may sound, when they put Keenan and Kel on like Paramount and all that stuff. So I binged that when I had a little time off last week.
Yeah, dude, same. I'm that all that stuff is right up my alley. My wife, I think, kind of gets annoyed with just how much I love the '90s and go back and watch the shows and
Yeah.
collect, some of the action figures from that era. So yeah, man, it's cool that we got that in common, dude. Let's kind of dive into your story here. So Matt, let's start off at the beginning. Where did you grow up?
So I grew up in a little town, like near a town called Rochester. This is a little suburb type, like little place, more cows than people, called Canisteo, New York. There really wasn't a lot going on there. Um, but I was raised in a pastor's home. And so from an early age, my mom played piano and did a lot of the stuff on the worship team. But around the age of 15 was when I kind of caught the rock and roll, bug, man. And I was all into rock and roll. These three brothers came to our church and they had recently converted from being Amish, but they went the exact opposite route from their upbringing when they finally cut loose from that. And they had the tattoos and the piercings. And um, I really
Amish gone
liked.
wild.
Yeah, dude, it was just such a wild thing, man. There were these three crazy brothers, and they just were into all sorts of like rock and roll, and they gave me my first Tooth and Nail compilation CD. And from there on out, man, I was just hooked to music. And really growing up, that was the one thing that made me feel empowered. And, you know, it took me a long time to find the voice that I am now, as far as just like being a singer. I never imagined it, but I always had the passion for it. And I always knew maybe deep down someday, some way I would find a way to do this.
Yeah, man. And you mentioned the word empowered, and digging into your story and the lead up to this interview, your life has had, quite a bit of challenges in a number of different areas. And so I'm wondering, can you kind of walk us through what are some of those challenges that you've had to face through even from, your earliest years?
Yeah, I was that kid that the doctors said would be dead. They expected me to die. They said there was pretty much a 0% chance that I would live. I was born with a traumatic brain injury. Um, and so as a result of that, lots of complications in the womb. And it really was like a trying time for my mom and all the doctors and everything like that. But as a result, I came out with two disabilities. I have cerebral palsy, and I have another lesser known disability called dyscalculia. And throughout my life, I just remember from an early age just struggling to try to conduct myself in ways that the other kids were. Like, I would get lost easily. I can't even drive to this day. So I was very socially withdrawn a lot of times. I remember going to physical therapy sessions where, I'd have to wear leg braces or, do all these things, and just kind of felt like the odd man out, man. It was a lot to deal with, but through it and later I've kind of found my strength. But at the time, man, it was just crazy and suffering through my education. And even where I'm at now, I'm very heavily dependent on family and stuff like that. So it has its downsides, but I mean, really, it's empowered me to speak out for those who don't have a voice.
Yeah, that's awesome, man. God works through everything. How does the cerebral palsy affect you, even to this day, Matt?
So if you were to see me walking, I walk with a pretty pronounced, not very pronounced, but pretty pronounced, like limp and everything. That was the challenging thing. But the disability that gets me the most was the dyscalculia, because it impedes my ability to drive. I remember it's a place in space, so you can't read maps. You can't do like a lot with finance, or like count. Like when I was on certain jobs, they keep me away from cash register, or and so I'd get lost often. And there was often times when like I'd get called out or even fired from a job for just getting lost, or people interpreting that I was just slacking off, because for the longest time it took me a while to talk about my disability. So my entire life was trying to either create a diversion or have a sense of humor. But it got exhausting just trying to hide what you were going through. And so in this season of my life, I've just seen that turn around, and it's been awesome.
Yeah, you mentioned kind of struggling to fit in, or to be quote unquote normal compared to the other kids. So what
Mhm.
was that like, going through grade school, middle school, even into high school? When it came to peer relationships, is that something that was a struggle? Did you deal with any bullying, or did people kind of rally around you? What was that like,
Oh
Matt?
yeah, I had a little bit of both, to where like I would suffer at the hands of the bullies and stuff, but because I had developed such a sense of humor, um, which was kind of like a survival mechanism for me. A lot of people would rally behind me. So a lot of the disenfranchised kids, or the kids that just didn't fit in themselves, or had juvenile delinquent backgrounds, they all stuck up for me for whatever reason. Like I was that kid where somebody tried to pick on me, and they often would get just punched in the face by somebody or whatever. Because I don't know, for whatever reason, I was disabled and everything, but I developed and cultivated a sense of humor and kind of just like a social awareness. Not that I like loved the idea of being different, but that was just something that I learned to work around, as opposed to a lot of the other kids. They didn't know how to crack a joke, or they didn't know how to, divert the attention away. So I felt bad for those kids and all that. But I still was the target of bullying and, just trying to feel normal.
Yeah. How did you cope with the bullying?
Oh man, I mean, lots of bumps and bruises, man. I mean, it was just a lot of, I don't know. Honestly, I'm not even really sure. Just like my mom was always my guiding light. Like she was always the one that was kind of um, helping me to be strong and encouraging me and all that kind of stuff. So I had her to really help me. I know that sounds a little hallmark, but that's just kind of the way it was.
Yeah. No, man, that's awesome that you had your mom there to,
Yeah.
like you said, kind of be your guiding light. You mentioned growing up in a pastor's home. What
Mhm.
was that like? I know for some people it's this awesome thing. For other people, it's not so awesome. What was your experience with that, Matt?
Yeah. So on one hand, I got to learn a lot about my faith, and I never really questioned my beliefs. As far as like, I always had the sense that God existed and that He um, wanted to be close to His creation or whatever. I always thought I never had a struggle with theology, but unfortunately for me, there was just a lot of hypocrisy in the church that I grew up in. I remember from a young age, like just suffering abuse at the hands of my dad, who was the preacher at the church.
Wow.
And it was just a crazy time because we would come home from church and then there'd be complete just arguments, flipping of tables, glass breaking. Oftentimes me and my dad would get into scuffles where there was blood on the floor, um, and things like that. And I mean, we had a lot wrong with us, but there was a whole bunch of people also in the church that were blind to what was going on and just wanted to serve God. So you had this segment of people that were sincere about their faith, and then this other segment that's just being completely hypocritical. So I found myself in this struggle of just trying to figure out what was real and what was fake, and just craving transparency. No matter what I was going through, whether it was bad or good, I was going to be the guy that was who I was, no matter what anybody thought. Like when I was a kid, I remember often getting in trouble because I'd be smoking in the church parking lot, and I was the pastor's son, and they'd be like, "Oh, dude, what are you doing?" Like it would freak them all out. But I was just that guy that was just like, I don't want to hide anything. I don't want to make it seem like anything. I don't want to make anything seem like it's hidden in my life. And so I was kind of that more outspoken kind of kid, um, and just wanted to be transparent.
Yeah, man, I can't imagine what that was like for you. In my mind, I'm envisioning, okay, you're in church on Sunday, your dad's up at the pulpit, preaching and talking about, the grace and the love of God. And then you come home, a few
Mhm.
hours later and you guys are getting into it, you're being abused. What kind of toll did that take on your mind and just from a psychological aspect? What was that like for you, man?
I think that like as when you're growing up in a situation like that, you often don't know um, that it's as toxic as it is until you get away from it. That's why I encourage so many people in mental health to take a step back, because I can characterize my dad one way. And yes, there was like heavy abuse, and there was like, times when we get in scuffles and blood on the floor. But there was also those times when we would laugh and have a good time. So it was like, you're raised in this environment, and you finally come to a point where you get the mental health that you need. And I remember, upon my parents' divorce in 2009, I had gone to counseling and I was talking about what I'd gone through, and I never called the abuse what it was. And so as I was talking about it, the counselor just paused and she's like, "So you mean you've been abused?" And I was like, oh, well, I mean, we got in fights and this and that. And she's like, "No, man, like I can tell, like I've been in this field for such a long time. You don't want to call it what it is. And you're so used to covering for somebody's actions that you kind of skirt around it, but that's what it is." And that was the moment of clarity for me where I was just like, man, it feels like a just bricks off my chest. Cause for once I was just calling it what it was.
Yeah, actually having the word for it, the label for it, sometimes just having that can give you so much empowerment, and like you said, just kind of bring clarity to, whoa, that's actually what was going on. When your parents divorced, what was that like for you, Matt? So 2009, you would have been how old at that time?
I was in my earlier 20s, I would say. So it was a very, very weird experience because not a lot of people knew what was going on within the church. Like we had gotten so used to sweeping things under the rug and coming to church with smiles on our face and bruises underneath our collars or whatever it was that like not a lot of people knew, and the people who did know that were in authority didn't want to get their hands dirty because at that point it felt like they were picking sides, or they didn't know who to who to trust, I suppose you could say. So there was a pretty big church split, and then my dad had started another church in the hometown in another denomination because they had eventually kind of thrown him out once everything was revealed. But it was just a weird process because you saw people that I grew up in church. I saw my some of my biggest friends and greatest friends and families that I'd grown up for years just never talked to me again because of the controversy with my family. And it was just like, oh my gosh, like I'd gone to youth group with these kids. I'd hung out with at them at like family dinners and stuff like that. And we revolved a lot of our life around the church. And so when that was happening, we just felt like we were walking around with a scarlet letter on, and, you know, everybody was just kind of like shocked and surprised and trying to unravel details of our past. It was crazy.
Yeah, it sounds like there was feelings of like rejection or maybe even abandonment there.
Yeah, absolutely. I think too, it was crazy because like I said, we waited so long to expose the truth that by the time we got around to it, people were questioning, if it was legitimate. And so there was a lot of people that just wanted to keep a good thing going. They had their comfortable church. They didn't care if the place was burning down to the ground or if I was, being mistreated. They just wanted to kind of live in that bubble of naivety, I guess you would say. And I found that a lot of the people that I grew up knowing, their houses were built on, in the Bible it says, build your house on, the rock. A lot of those
Yep.
people lost their faith. It shook them to the very core. I remember one of my Sunday school teachers who I grew up with. He got really heavy into drinking and got arrested a few times after everything hit the fan. And so it devastated a lot of people, and it really showed their true dedication to the faith. I mean, I wish everybody well, but yeah, everybody showed their true colors.
Yeah. So with going through that situation, Matt, and then even just everything with your dad, how did that affect your ability to trust people? Again, I'm kind of putting myself into your shoes. I'm just like, oh man, like I think I'd have a really hard time being able to trust people. What was that like for you?
Yeah, when we got thrown out of our church, there was a period of time where we all loved God. We all knew that we wanted to continue to press on with God, but we just did not. Every time anything would remind me of my past in a church, or if any facet of what I was experiencing kind of reminiscent of my past, I would freeze up. So there was a time where I just didn't even go to church. I would, you know, or when I did go to church, it'd be the exact opposite denomination of where I was raised. And so I just wanted nothing that resembled the past. I've long since healed, and I'm not saying that I'm like, I trust everything now, but I'm a little bit more open-minded and kind of learn life's lessons. But yeah, I mean, I had songs in the past called in one of the projects called March of the Damned, which was about corrupt church leadership and leading people off a cliff. And so it was a huge thing for me growing up, and huge part of my story.
Yeah. How did going through all that, and even just kind of as you were younger, you know, you're looking at your dad, and every young boy kind of looks up to their dad, right? And when you're kind of going through this, and especially when you went to counseling as a teenager, and you finally kind of had the words to accurately describe what was happening to you, how did that impact your relationship with God, or seeing God as like your heavenly father?
Yeah, I mean, man, it was a crazy experience when I finally kind of went to counseling and called the abuse what it was. Because, like I said, we lived in such a way that we didn't even really fully realize how toxic it had been. Like, I'd have friends coming over that wouldn't want to be over again because my dad and I would have, fights or whatever. Oftentimes our pets would even go, like, be withdrawn because it was such tension in the house. And I didn't really realize it until I went to counseling and put all these pieces together. But as far as how it related to God, it's just, like I said, I've always known that he'd existed, and somehow I always kept the idea that he was a loving God for whatever reason. I had my bitterness towards him, maybe. I mean, I vented a lot of frustration. But at the end of the day, I always believed. And, not to say that I was always perfect or anything like that, but at the end of the day, my faith was solid. It was just, I questioned a lot of things.
Yeah. No, that makes sense, man. And that's awesome, though, that through everything, your faith did remain solid. I almost kind of see that as God's grace and God's covering over you in that way. And so you mentioned going to counseling, and I've seen, and we were talking before we pushed the record button, that at one point you were in the psych ward. And so what kind of led up to that, Matt, with your mental health?
Okay, so there was just a lot going on at home. Tensions were really, really high. Just every time when I would, I was just that kid where like, um, what was I going to say? Yeah, I just had a lot of tussles with my dad over just stupid things. Like, there would be times when just arguments would erupt over nothing or a weird look, and I'd be like, what? You got that little bit of that teenage angst in you, and when you're dealing with
Yep.
somebody who is not a very stable person, a little bit like the punishments and all that stuff can be blown out of proportion. So I remember just going toe to toe with my dad a lot. I had just broken up with a girlfriend of mine. Her parents were a little bit um, strange, and so they banned me from seeing her. We had been going out for a long time, and they kept me from seeing her. And she tried to kill herself, so she was in the psych ward and everything a week prior to when I went in, because of cutting and all that kind of stuff. And so it was just a really turbulent time when it came to family, when it came to breaking up with my first, what I would call my first love, my first relationship at that time. And I just felt really lost. I had nowhere to turn. And even the most intimate, like, details about my father's abuse, I never really went. I couldn't talk to anybody about it. I couldn't talk to even the girlfriend that I had at the time. So in between a breakup, between troubles at home, and just trying to figure out myself, I ended up in the psych ward, and it was a really dark time for me.
Yeah, how did you get through that dark time, man? What role did your faith play in that?
Oh man, it was like I said, I think God has just steadily kept me on course. It's not like during that time I was praying a lot or just like surrendering to him fully, but I feel like God just always had his eye on me and always kind of kept me strong. And like I said, like, I think one of the most weird realizations and the darkest realizations that I had during that time in the psych ward was that when I got out, nothing would be resolved. So I was going to be in there. I couldn't tell anybody about the problems. I was covering for a whole church infrastructure that we had. Um, and I was so used to, just there was so much at risk. If I had blown my father in, maybe CPS would take the kids and I would have to live somewhere else. So one of the stunning realizations was just that whenever I went to the psych ward or whenever I got out, that, like, they wanted to hear how healed I was and how great I was doing. And I just knew deep down that it was all going to have to be a facade because I'd go home to the same situation. And that was a really hard thing. And it took years and years to continue fighting through it, even after my time in the psych ward.
Yeah, man, that's it just sounds like a lot of pressure to put on yourself too, right? You know, that pressure, that responsibility. It sounds like you really felt like I got to kind of keep this image up. Like you said, that this facade of like everything's fine, but man, if only people knew what was going on behind closed doors.
Yeah, I think in a lot of ways too, our family had adopted this wrongful um, kind of like theory, I guess you could say, or practice of just kind of trying to save face with God, or like trying to be God's attorney, defense attorney, like, so if I tell them that our family's going through this, then they might backslide, or they might like turn their back on their faith, or they might look at us in a different way. And so we played this whole thing where we were just like, and I know that my family meant well, my mom meant well with this, but it was just one of those things that like we just grew up to do, was just like, we got to save God, we got to save God's face. And it was
Yeah.
it was a really dark time, but I've come through a lot of it, and I find that with the honesty that I've had, people are being touched through it. So
For sure, man, for sure. And I really am inspired by your honesty and your realness and your rawness. And I mean, your music is all about that. Kind of tidying up the whole psych ward situation. So it sounds like, though, again, just kind of talking to you and doing some research, God kind of brought that situation full circle for you, because you were once, a patient in the psych ward, but then you ended up working in the psych ward. So how did God work through all that? How did that happen?
yeah, absolutely. So yeah, as I said, I was a patient. I fought through it, and it's not like there was a time when my mental health battles just completely stopped. Even during the time when I was being a mental health aide in the psych ward, I would still have anxiety attacks and things like that. But I just knew I wanted to use my life to help other people. So I got, my stepdad had worked a job as a mental health aide, and he got me the job there. And so my job was to plan activities for the patients. It was for to cook snacks for them, and just to kind of like, and I got to sit down with a lot of people and try to hear their stories as well, and kind of what brought them in. And it was really just a crazy full circle experience. And like I said, I wasn't completely healed from every aspect of my anxiety. I just found myself in a better place. And it's just a testament to how God uses the broken to reach the broken. You don't have to continue to be put all the way together. Just let God use the pieces that you have together, and he'll do the rest, and so that's all I can say is like, even during times when I was in the psych ward, there'd be times I'd have to go home because I had anxiety attacks or was fighting through something. But God really used me in that time to fight alongside a lot of people that were going through their own battle.
Yeah, and man, that's just like God to do that, right? He doesn't call the equipped, he equips the called. And it sounds like for a season of your life there, he called you to go there. And even though you were battling through some anxiety and some mental health stuff, to still be a blessing to others, and to still be the light to others. And so that's awesome that you had that opportunity. You mentioned stepdad. And so I mean, as a therapist, I'm curious, going through everything that you did with your dad, what was it like when your stepdad came into your life? As far as building trust with him, building a relationship with him, what was
Okay,
that like for you, Matt?
so this is kind of a weird story, but my stepdad was actually the bass player on the worship team that we had at the church. So during this time when my dad was being really harsh and abusive and stuff like that, it felt like my family had nowhere to go. Nobody would listen. My mom had tried to seek people, but they just would whitewash it. And like I said, my mom grew up playing piano for the worship team, and my stepdad at the time was just a friend of ours, and he played bass and everything. And through this whole situation, um, he was the only one that would hear everything out, and so he's really helped me in time. It was like I said, an adjustment sometimes, but it was kind of a slow process to where they got together. It wasn't like this overnight thing, but through just hearing the stories of what my mom and I were going through, we all kind of forged a friendship, a relationship, and over time, things have just healed to the point where they just decided to get married and stuff. I mean, it was a crazy time, and it was, you don't really hear stories like that, but when you're going through something and somebody just takes the time to listen, that's what it is, man. And so, my stepdad is currently here, and he also helps me a lot with on tour. He's the bus driver for the tour. He helps in a lot of like, just arranging events and doing things that I can't do due to my disabilities and stuff like that. He'll be the first person to kind of help organize and things.
That's awesome, man. That's awesome to have kind of that healthy father figure in your life now, and showing you that father's love, and showing your mom, what a good husband love looks like as well. I'm sure that has been impactful as you, as well as you mentioned you're in a relationship now, and so just seeing that dynamic, I'm sure, has been powerful as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Like my stepdad was one of the guys that like really encouraged me in music and stuff like that too. So like, he was at first, before I ever thought I'd be a singer, he was the first one to teach me some bass riffs and got me really interested in, music in general. And then about the time that things happened to where I was a singer, he was there alongside, just encouraging. And he's been the guy from the beginning that's kind of like encouraged the project, encouraged me to continue to tell my story. So, hey, man, it's awesome. And yeah, it's great.
Yeah. No, I'm so glad to hear that, man. So then 15 years old, you get that Tooth and Nail compilation, kind of like being really sucked into the rock genre, getting a taste of that. And throughout everything that we talked about, man, throughout all the struggles that you've had, it sounds like music has always been an outlet for you. Like it was one thing that was maybe always safe for you.
Yeah, absolutely, man. It was, like I said, it was the one thing that kind of made me feel empowered. I lived in a small, boring town. I was a scrawny, disabled kid. And, although I had a great sense of humor, at times I just hated my life. And so when I would walk around town to escape the chaos of my home or do whatever, I just slap on headphones, and music gave me a place to go. I mean, I remember just listening to bands like Disciple, Blink 182. I just was all over the board. And as I was walking around town, I'd envision a life outside of that small town and maybe doing the band thing like a lot of my idols at the time. So, yeah, music was just the one place where I could just put on headphones and be gone somewhere for a while and just in my own thoughts and in my own heads and then just thinking about the future or the future that I wish to have.
Yeah, man. At what point did you realize, hey, I can sing, and maybe this is something I can make a career out of?
Oh man, that was a very, very slow process. So upon my first project, it was called Transparent, and my original plan was just to play bass and write the songs. But what ended up happening is every time I would draft a singer, they would quit within like the first week. So I was really discouraged. I was really down about like, man, why can't I just find a singer that sticks? And what had happened was kind of a funny thing. I went to this church, like I told you, I had gotten thrown out of my one church. So I was looking and kind of church hopping around the area, never really knew a lot of people. But I went to this one church this Sunday, and this lady that I barely knew, that I maybe had met like for a very short time once, was preaching that morning. And in the middle of her sermon, she ordered me to stand up. She said, "Hey, son, can you stand up?" And I was all nervous. I was like, I don't know what is going on here, man. I don't get it. And she had no idea about my music, but she brought me forward and she said, "Today you're standing in front of maybe 200 people, but God wants to let you know that one day you'll stand before many, many more, and you're going to have a huge impact in music." And I was like, all for that. And I was like, okay, yeah, like
Yeah.
I'm down. But then she said, "And he wants you to sing." And that's when my heart just dropped out of my chest. I had never sang a note in my life. I had never assumed that I could do it. I listened to like bands like Linkin Park, and I admired like Chester Bennington and all his stuff. But um, for me to be a frontman was just a really, really far-fetched idea for me. So I I was not the front man that I am today, confident and all that kind of stuff. I was very timid. And so when she said sing, it took me about 2 to 3 weeks, a battle with myself to really just put it all aside and say, if God's called me to do this and I want it done, I'm going to just have to grow into this role. And that's exactly what happened. You just grow into that role that God does, line upon line, precept upon precept, and eventually get where you're going.
Yeah, man. I mean, it's clear that God had that call on your life, and that lady prophesied over you. And you know, like you said, you liked the first part, but then the second part, just like, wait a second, I'm not a singer. And I just think of like Moses, right? Like when God commissioned him to speak for the people, he's just like, I'm not a speaker. Let Aaron do it. And so, I mean, it's cool that just to see your obedience in that, right? To just trust God that, okay, God, if you called me to it, I'm just going to walk in this. And so you mentioned being in a couple different bands. Now you're a solo act, Matt. At what point did you make the decision or kind of feel the call that, okay, now it's time to step out and do my own thing?
Okay, so yeah, like when I was in a lot of bands, I loved it. Like I loved the whole band thing, but unfortunately, it was just really hard to find people with either the same work ethic or the same spiritual views or background, or people that would stick with it for more than 2 weeks at a time or whatever it was. And so I had that band Transparent. We had just been a small town band, but we had a big break through a series of events. One of the first songs I ever wrote, called Bridges, was featured on a NASCAR video game along with Stain and Hailstorm and all this stuff. We were just a small town band. That
Wow.
eventually, yeah, it was crazy, man. So I was just, this guy from nowhere. And, when you fire up NASCAR, the game Inside Line, one of the first songs I ever wrote, called Bridges, is the main menu next to all these bands. And I was unknown. At that point, I didn't really know how to manage the music industry. So that opportunity kind of came and went. That band had broken up. And my family, which is really supportive, my mom and stepdad, had decided that, if we're going to ever do this, we got to move to an area where it's going on. So I think around 2014, I established another band called Transparent Soul. That was kind of the Tennessee version of my original band, under the wing of Travis Wyrick, who's a producer that's done Disciple and all this kind of stuff. And then that eventually kind of broke up. And so over time, it just got increasingly important that I just do this on my own. I saw a clip of Post Malone, and he was surrounded by a whole bunch of people in this huge thing, and it was just him and a track. And I know a lot of people in the rock world, that'll be something I catch flack for, but I'm like, you know what? If he can do this with just tracks and nobody's really, booing him off stage, why don't I just do that? And so that was kind of my thing. I wouldn't call my style much like Post Malone, but that was kind of like the realization of like, wow, like he's got some screens, he's got some cool effects, and he's doing it all by himself. And so that was kind of God leading me into this whole solo project.
Man, that's awesome. And so eventually you released your first EP, and was that in 2019 or what year was that?
Yes, I think that was 2019. That EP that CD was called Transcend, and that was produced by a local producer here named Colton Carnley, who was kind of the protege of Travis Wyrick, who's done a lot of different things. And his thing was more pop. He liked a lot of pop and EDM and all that kind of stuff. And at the time, I was writing for a lot of just different like TV commercials and things, or trying to get into that world. I never imagined that I would be performing those tracks out live or anything, but like they ended up coming together. And that album is a lot different than In Defiance, but it kind of set the tone for like the electronic influence you hear in my current work. I think the difference between In Defiance and Transcend is Transcend's maybe a little safer lyrically. In Defiance was the time when I would just kind of took all the gloves off and said, I'm going to write exactly how I feel. I know why I'm here. I feel like God's given me this new direction. So it's like this combination of rock and EDM and the honest lyrics and everything like that.
Yeah. Yeah. And like you said, kind of that first step in the direction of really getting yourself out there, because the following year you were invited to tour with GFM. And unfortunately, this thing called COVID popped
Yeah.
up and kind of cut that tour really short. Talk us through that, Matt. And I know, again, just kind of looking through your Instagram and whatnot, that 2020 in general was, I mean, it was hard year for all of us, but you went through a couple big things in 2020 there. So let's maybe talk about that. How did you deal with the tour getting cut short, with,
Mhm.
now, being in quarantine, and just everything that happened that year?
Yeah, I mean, it was a shock, man. It was a really big shock. Like I said, I faced a lot of isolation growing up because of my disabilities and not being able to drive. And so the isolation of COVID, while everybody else was like, oh man, this is the hardest thing, that definitely was not the hardest thing for me as far as the isolation goes. But when I was signed up to go on this tour with GFM, I was super excited about it. I had waited for years and years, multiple projects, to finally go on a tour that lasted a while. And day and night, I'd be practicing, I'd be getting all ready. And, you invest in merchandise and you get your tour vehicle ready and you do all the things that you're supposed to do before tour. And it was just one of those things where it was like, I was so excited and so pumped for this to happen. And like I said, we did one show in Fort Worth, Texas. There was chatter all around the venue about this new virus that has come out and everything like that. And everybody was speculating about it. And little by little, just shows just kept shutting down. So I was sent home with GFM and all the rest of the music scene that feels me on this, man, for a whole year. And because of that depression, I just felt like I just really went through a really dark time in 2020. I mean, I felt like God had called me to this big thing and that I was off to my big start. And again, it just collapsed right before my eyes. And I think when you deal with disabilities and you grow up with disabilities, that's a common thread in your life. You just see a lot of things like your efforts kind of fail forward. And so when I did that, because of the depression I was facing, I got into a relationship that was very toxic at the time. And yeah, for that entire year was just really downward spiral for me.
Yeah, and again, with your Instagram, you've been very transparent and raw about that relationship. And you were, I think it was sometime in the summer, you were about ready to perform at a festival, and
Yeah.
some things happened. Kind of walk us through that, Matt.
Yeah. So I had gotten to this relationship in my low time. Um, and like I said, was really dealing with a lot of it. I didn't know until she kind of moved closer to my area that she was very narcissistic, and we would have frequent arguments all the time. And just she would tear down my character. She would tell me, you shouldn't do the music thing. It's not practical. Why don't you just quit all that stuff and make your life about me? I'm like, oh man, I mean, that's a pretty crazy statement. So I was being hounded and badgered a lot about what my direction was in life. And so, yeah, that relationship just was like a huge downward spiral all the time. And I remember I had one show planned that year against my better judgment. In between times, I had gotten engaged to this person. I was set to, you know, be a fiance, live the fiance life and everything like that. And yeah, like during 2020 and everything, I was getting ready to perform the one show that I had that year. And a couple minutes before I got on stage, um, that girl called me and she said she had no use for me anymore and she was leaving. So as I was performing Pit Fest 2020, I knew that my fiance at the time was leaving. And so I knew that as I was on stage, she was packing her bags and going. But that ended up kind of being one of those things that, like, that was really bad at the time, but it really was one of the things that opened up a whole bunch of opportunity. As soon as she left out of my life, it was weird because like it felt like God just went, okay, now that that's out of the way, I'm going to open all these doors for you. And right around then, a lot of people were rallying behind me in my inbox and just saying, man, we're praying for you. We believe God still has a plan for your life. Don't give up. That was God's rescue mission. And a year later, I can testify that it was, because I did my first international tour with Seventh Day Slumber.
Man, just like God, right? Just like God to turn what, at the time was this super disastrous situation for you, right? I mean, just kind of a knife to the heart, and then turn it into like the biggest blessing, because yeah, like you said, you got to do this international tour with Seventh Day Slumber, and now you're signed to their
Yeah.
label, to Rockfest Records. What was that like? Like when you, I don't know if it was a phone call or a conversation, but when they offered you that deal to, hey, come on board, man,
Oh,
what were you feeling?
man, well, I'll kind of back it up how I kind of ended up meeting them and everything too. So my stepdad is a big,
Yeah.
we've been fans of Seven Day Slumber since I can remember, man. Like I remember growing up listening to them, and just really being inspired by Joe and the rest of the band. And so we keep track of all their lives. When they go live on Instagram or Facebook or social media, we're usually the first to know. And so whenever Joe would go live, my stepdad would get on there and be like, "Hey man, I'm with Matt Sassano Music. When are you going to take him on tour? When are you going to take him on tour?" And at the first time, I totally understand it. Joe was kind of just like, playing nice. And he's like, "Hey man, we'll see. We'll see what goes on." So finally, around, after all this hassling Joe and all this kind of stuff, I finally step in the studio with Josiah. And I'm working with Josiah, and I'm kind of new to this whole touring experience or how to break into it. And I said, "Hey, Josiah, dude, just like kind of help me out here, man. Like, who do I talk to about touring?" And Josiah is like, "Hey, man, have you ever like considered going on the road with maybe Joe Rowe? I know he puts together some really good tours, Seventh Day Slumber and everything." And I think behind the scenes, Josiah was really rallying for me. He's like, "I got this new kid, and he's new to the whole touring thing, but he seems like a really talented guy or whatever. And would you take him on tour?" And at first, the story is that Joseph was like, "No," because like I was an unknown commodity, like nobody knew me. I mean, that could have been a huge risk for Joe, but I think after just a little more probing and a little bit more like just bugging him and getting him to hear my story and what I was about, he said, "Hey man, like I like your story. I like what you're about. I've heard some of your stuff, and you're recording with Josiah." I was like, "Yeah." And he's like, "Well, why don't you just join us for our first recovery tour and everything, and we'll just take you on." And so that was the first thing. I did my first show with Seventh Day Slumber in Westville, Oklahoma. And so the rest was history, man. And then a few tours later, when I kind of proved that I was worth my salt and that I was, could put on a show and I could do all that kind of stuff and I wasn't going to bug anybody too bad, he was like, "Hey man, why don't we just sign you to the label?" At that point, Not My Name was released during the first tour of Seven Day Slumber, and it had done well on Christian rock radio. And so Joseph was like, "Hey man, loved the story, loved how you engaged the fans, loved that your song is doing so well. So welcome to Rockfest Records." And now I've got Rockfest, I'm certified. So
There it
that's
is, man. There's the shirt.
yeah, it's been awesome.
I love it, man. I love it, man. What a story. I love that. Just kind of the insistence of your stepdad to kind of put that bug in Joe's ear. And I mean, yeah, just the events that transpired. You're working with, Josiah from Disciple, and he knows Joe Rowe, and here you are, all this time later, and you came out with that In Defiance EP, and man, these songs pack a punch, dude. Like I love this stuff. I love just, again, your vulnerability in the lyrics. I mean, just going through every song. I know one that is really raw and personal is Guilty Pleasure, and that talks about the struggles with pornography. And man,
Absolutely.
for you to be willing to put that struggle out there, I just am so like inspired by you to do that, because obviously it's a struggle that not just a lot of men but a lot of women struggle with as well. So what was it like kind of sharing that part of your life, that struggle with the world?
Yeah, I mean, I think like I said, I always, from a time that I was born and from the time that I was raised in the environment that I was raised, I always craved transparency, man. Like I said, I hated the hypocrisy. I hated the idea that people would hide things. And so even when I was going through stuff that wasn't particularly, a proud moment or whatever, I want to be the first person to be open about what I was going through. And so as I said, I spent a lot of time in isolation because of my disabilities. And when you're in isolation and you're lonely because that tends to be a temptation with the pornography and everything. I'd like to say that it's like all gone now and everything, but it's still kind of like an everyday fight, for me to continue to not do that. But I think that that's one of the things that's, not only really rocked the church and all that kind of stuff, but there's a lot of people that have come out in the mainstream and talked about the harmful effects of pornography. We just recently had Billie Eilish talk about how it messed up her mind. Lamar Odom, the basketball player, was talking about the evils of it. We have Terry Crews and Russell Brand, the comedian. So I think that this is a conversation that is now extending beyond the church to the mainstream, to where it's like, maybe we thought this was innocent, but it's something that really does devastate a lot of people, and physically and mentally can be harmful.
For sure, man. And like I said, I super appreciate you sharing that, because I know in you doing that, you're helping other people and you're blessing other people and giving them hope that they can overcome that struggle as well. And one of the other songs on the EP, Dear God, and another powerful story in that song. And you're actually doing something really cool with that song and in a partnership with the Hope Line here. So tell us about that, Matt.
Yeah, so my newest single, "Dear God," is just released, and we're really excited. It's now currently number 5 on the Christian rock charts. So I'm so blessed because I'm
Let's
getting,
go.
yeah, man, it's awesome. I'm getting so many messages every day saying, this song has really helped me in my mental health battle. I also am very isolated. Just continuous stories, and so we came up with this idea of um, letting that song be the outlet for people to reach out for mental health. So I'm going to be partnering with an organization called Keep Choosing Life, and another organization called the Hope Line, where people can um, get the mental health help that they need. We've launched a landing page on the internet that's called mydeargodletter.com, where people can write their own letters to God, vent their frustrations, ask about their purpose, kind of really articulate their feelings. When I was at my lowest, one thing that I did just to clear my mind was writing letters to God to clear my mind, to try to gain clarity. And so, mydeargodletter.com gives people the opportunity to get real with their problems, to write their own Dear God letter, and have the opportunity to, um, get the mental health help that they need.
Dude, I love it, and such a needed message in this generation, and you're helping to lead the way with that. And I'll link all that stuff in the comments or in the show notes below, so you guys can all find it. But I really believe in that message as well, man. And it's so cool how God has brought that partnership for you. You know, something that obviously you've struggled with, and the thing that stands out to me though is that you've kept the faith through it all, like you said, just that faith in God. And unfortunately that's not everyone's case, but I think you're a shining example, Matt, of, hey, even though we struggle, God is in our struggles, and he will never leave us, he will never forsake us, just like his word says. And so, man, you are just a great example of this phrase might sound weird or awkward, but like, to struggle well, right?
Yeah.
Because I think there's a difference between struggling recklessly and then struggling well. And we struggle well when we hold on to our faith in God. And man, you in general are just an inspiration. Your life has God written all over it. And a couple last questions for you, Matt, before I let you go.
Sure.
Number one, if there's someone listening to this right now who they have a disability, maybe they also have cerebral palsy or dyscalculia, or whether it's dyslexia or whatever disability it may be, what advice do you have for them to just keep moving forward?
Oh man, that's a hard one. I wish that I just had one concrete answer, but my whole life has been a process of trying to uncover that and everything. But I do try to just encourage people that you are not the labels that people have put on you. I know it took a lot of time to overcome for me and to see myself as somebody who is worthwhile and everything like that. And I really, like I said, um, I just encourage everybody just to continue to pray and to press in with God. I know that sometimes can sound like a cliche, but it really does help in discovering your purpose and everything like that. Get a nice support group. If you've got a family or friends that are supportive of you, always just continue to surround yourself in that. And hopefully, when people make fun of you and stuff like that, one of the things that I've learned was just to be to develop like that sense of humor and not take myself so seriously. I know that's hard sometimes for a lot of people, but hopefully you're able to kind of navigate those waters and just realize that God created you the individual that you're going to be. And I'm not going to say that it's going to be an overnight process. It's going to take a long time. It's taken me as long as I've been alive, but God is with you. And just trust and believe that, man, and just press in for his plan and purpose every day.
Amen. Amen. Last question for you, Matt. As you look back at the goodness of God in your life, what comes to mind?
Oh man, I am just really just blessed and fortunate, man. Really. I mean, for somebody who has been told by doctors and teachers and peers and even myself that I would never mount to anything, that I'd never do anything significant, that I was not the one that God called to do this or that, that I was too shy or too this or too that. God is really, it says in the Bible that he'll uh, prepare a table with you for you in the presence of your enemies. And I feel like a lot of the people that have defamed me or doubted me or slandered me are all kind of being proved wrong now. And I don't take the credit for that, man. That's God's. I've worked hard to get here, but God supplied me and gave me these burdens that I have. That's producing the music that's coming out today. So, yeah, man, I would just say to anybody out there, continue to use not only your support system as a positive, but those who doubt you and defame you and all these kinds of things, use that as fuel to keep getting back up, you know?
I love it. I love it, man. Matt, this was awesome. This was such a pleasure getting to talk to you. How can people find you online and follow you?
Yeah, so I've got Instagram and Facebook. You can go to mattsassano.com as well, my official website. It's still kind of under construction, but Facebook and Instagram are probably the best places to reach me, and I'm on there more than the average person. So I'm not going to say my track record's been exactly perfect, but if you try to reach out to me, I will do my 100% best to reply back and everything like that. I really appreciate everybody. And I want everybody to remember that my new CD is out now. It's called In Defiance. And it's a reminder and a call to action to stand in defiance to whatever brings you down, makes you feel alone or worthless. And I hope you guys dig it.
And that's exactly what you're doing, Matt. You are standing in defiance to everything that the enemy has tried to use to harm you and destroy you. Man, just your faith in God, you're allowing God to use it all for good. And he's being glorified now, man, just through your life, through your music. And I'm excited to see where this goes. I know you're just getting started. God's got so many amazing things in store for you. And man, I'm going to be along for the ride with you.